And I've seen this in a lot of my critics and stuff online who have basically said, how can you say that what the Pope is doing here is not infallible? Look at what he says. And they post snippets of the formula used in the ceremony for canonization. The formula is great, but the formula doesn't make the person a saint in a way that's binding on the faithful. The process has to do it. And the conception behind what it means to be a saint isn't even the same, because there are saints everywhere. So for a lot of you young, angry e-Catholic Zoomer guys who are in this weird middle ground between being traditional and being modernists, who seem to love all the trappings of Catholicism from like a social perspective, but don't know how to think their way out of a paper bag and just proof text like Protestants. You have no right defending the Catholic Church against the world, against other sects. You have no right to call anybody heretics in the ultimate sense. Because guess what? Martin Luther might be a saint. Bonhoeffer might be a saint. The Orthodox, theologian from 800 years ago, writing about how the Catholic Church was vile and evil for all its, nastiness, venerated by some monks and Athos, he's a saint, according to the Second Vatican Council, according to how those after the Second Vatican Council have interpreted the Council and imposed reforms. You're in a real tough position. So you either got to go with tradition, or you got to go with modernism. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be investigating a deep dive into the infallibility of canonizations. It's an important topic, and there are a lot of misconceptions I've realized when talking about canonizations, especially in the post-conciliar sense, meaning after the Second Vatican Council. Obviously, for many of us, we would ask ourselves, why would I ever even ask this question? Why wouldn't I just trust that all canonizations are infallible? Well, there are a lot of things to go over, such as the distinctions between beatifications and canonizations, such as the fact that for the first 1,000 years or so of the Church, the idea that canonizations as such, as an act of the Pope, were infallible was never even considered. The fact that the process has been radically changed since basically the 1980s, and so forth. And we're going to go into all of that here. Stay tuned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you are watching this as it's been released, you're either watching the free preview or you are someone who is either a Substack subscriber or a YouTube member. And it'll be available in full in about a week or so for the rest of you. But if you want to catch these things as they come out, then there you go. You can sign up underneath. Also, I will be putting all the links to all of the information I will be citing for this topic. This is going to be a longer episode, at least an hour, maybe more, maybe 2 parts. I might have to stop recording and cut 2 videos together. I don't know how long this is going to take me, but I don't want to leave any stone left unturned. You see, the issue of canonizations is very near and dear to all of our hearts. We are Catholics. We believe in saints. We venerate saints. And the old term was worship, and that's actually what we do with saints, if properly understood. But Protestants don't know what worship is, so we try to soften the blow a bit. But it is a type of worship in the technical sense, although that's taboo to say, but that's what it is if you look at the old theological manuals. We don't worship saints like God in the sense we offer a sacrifice, but we worship in the sense where we give veneration and honor and ask for intercession, which is a type of worship. But anyway, but there are a lot of saints that have happened since the Second Vatican Council. Some of them have been very questionable. We can imagine other saints, other supposed saints being canonized that may be even more questionable. I mean, are we going to see a Saint Maciel, the guy who started the Legionaries of Christ? That sort of thing. People might think that's absurd, but there have been some pretty absurd canonizations since the 1980s. Now, that being said, it's not the intention of this episode to talk too much about individual saints. There will be a couple examples mentioned as I read through the material because they occasioned this research to be done when it was done, but I'm not here to say, I think so and so is or so and so isn't. I also want to say that the veneration of saints is as old as the Church, and long before it was an official promulgated, generally speaking, considered infallible process, it was the the normal way for saints was basically holy men and women died, and a cultus, sort of a devotion developed around their lives and works and so forth, and intercession was asked and miracles were given. And that was kind of as far as it went. And so you can ask anyone to pray for you in heaven. Anyone who is in heaven is a saint in the small s sense. That's true. But we're talking about saint in the big S sense, meaning those canonized for the sake of admiration, veneration, their place in the liturgy, and a model to follow. So we're going to talk about that process. All right, I'm going to pull up my research here, and I'm using, I'll link all the articles. The best research I've found is from two sources, and this is as far as something that's easily shared. From Father Michel Glaise, who is a wonderful theologian of the Society of St. Pius X, and Mr. John Lamont, who I believe is a fellow Canadian, and he's a very sound, very prolific Catholic philosopher and theologian, and he's written extensively on a number of topics. There is a slight disagreement between Father Glaise and Mr. Lamont's opinions. Father Glaise is of the opinion that we'll see that in the general sense as it used to be done, what we'll talk about, that canonizations were in fact certain in their infallibility, whereas they aren't now, and we'll get to why. And John Lamont makes the argument that we can actually argue that they were never infallible in the truest sense, which doesn't mean that we don't actually believe there are infallibly saints, but just that the process itself never actually lent itself officially to infallibility. I don't go as far as Mr. Lamont, but he does have really good points that do complement what we're going to talk about. Now, for those of you who get nervous when you hear the word Society of St. Pius X, well, maybe see a therapist about that. But in all seriousness, just as a little background, Father Glaise is a very honored and recognized theologian, not just by traditionalists. In fact, when the society is doing doctrinal discussions and things like that over the years, Father Glaise sits at the table with Rome's best and brightest, and they work together as equals to try to come to understanding. So he's recognized for his intelligence and so forth. By not just traditionalists. Now, that being said, if you are a traditionalist, you'll probably have no issue with these men that I'm citing. And if you are not a traditionalist and watch this video because you want to get mad at me because, look at me, I'm such a schismatic, well, okay, continue watching and you can think what you will, but it behooves you, if you want to actually know what you're talking about, to assess the strongest arguments possible so you can refute them. And if you want to do that, go for it. So these are the strongest arguments that you're going to find assessing the question of canonizations and their infallibility from the traditionalist perspective, let's call it that. And I want to show you one quick thing before we begin. So here is a little short summary from the Catholic Encyclopedia, and I chose to use it from Catholic Answers website, Catholic.com, because I wanted to show you this wasn't just some sort of like rad-trad pseudo-scholarship. If Catholic Answers has done much good work, I disagree with much of what some of their personalities say, especially in light of claims about traditional Catholicism. Nonetheless, they are a very serious outlet, and I just want to read something here. And this is from the section on papal infallibility and canonization. So this is not my opinion. This is not even a traditionalist opinion. This is long before Second Vatican Council, and it's shared by Catholic Answers. So, is the Pope infallible in issuing a decree of canonizations? Most theologians answer in the affirmative. It is the opinion of Saint Antoninus, Melchior Cano, Suarez, Bellarmine, Banez, Vasquez, and among the canonists of Gonzalez, Tellez, and many other names, etc., 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 and many others. St. Thomas says, since the honor we pay to the saints is in a certain sense a profession of faith, i.e. a belief in the glory of saints, we must piously believe that in this matter also the judgment of the Church is not liable to error. These words of St. Thomas, as is evident from the authorities just cited, all favoring a positive infallibility, have been interpreted by his school in favor of papal infallibility in the matter of canonization. And this interpretation is supported by several other passages in the same quod libet. This infallibility, however, according to the Holy Doctor, is only a point of pious belief. Theologians generally agree as to the fact of papal infallibility in this matter of canonization, but disagree as to the quality of certitude due to a papal decree in such matter. In the opinion of some, it is of faith. Others hold that to refuse assent to such a judgment of the Holy See would be both impious and rash, as Suarez Many more hold such a pronouncement to be theologically certain, not being of divine faith as its purport has not been immediately revealed, nor of ecclesiastical faith as having thus far not been defined by the church. And there is the kicker right there, not being defined by the church. So we're going to go through the very strong arguments in favor of the infallibility of canonizations and then sort of try to talk about how that's a little different story nowadays. But as of yet, this idea that it is defined that if you dissent from this, and you don't recognize so-and-so as a saint, that you are somehow a heretic or whatever, that's just simply not true, and it can't be said by people. A lot of people out there on Twitter have come after me in recent days saying this is a mortal sin and blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, that's just not what the church says. If the church defines it in a particular way one day that is beyond doubt, then that will be what it'll be. But that just hasn't happened. So until that happens, men of goodwill can discuss these things. And that's all we're going to do here. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, but no one is in any position to call anyone bad names or say that they're, sinning against the faith or whatever, because that's not what the church says. Okay. So here is an introduction to the research, and I've got all the links underneath. The SSPX, the US website, updated their website not too long ago, and a lot of their old articles have been lost for some reason from there. Maybe the folks at the IT department there can fix that, but I found them on the archive. So you can actually link them there, and that's why I'm going to be using the archive instead of the SSPX publication website. All right. So this research is initially from 2011, and Father Glaze raises three difficulties: the inadequacy of the procedure, the collegiality, and the concept of heroic virtue. And again, this is just an introduction. Heroic virtue of saints is the most telling indicator of the divinity of the Church, and ordinarily this mark is itself authenticated. It receives the seal of the Church, which answers for its own holiness by canonization, the solemn act by which the sovereign pontiff, making a final definitive judgment, declares the heroic virtue of a member of the Church. Canonization comes under the category of disciplinary facts, among which theologians classify the various laws promulgated for the good of the whole Church, and which correspond to secondary objects of the infallible teaching authority. Among these are the universal liturgical law, which prescribes the manner by which the worship due to God is rendered; canonization, which is the law by which the Church prescribes the veneration of one of the faithful departed who exercised perfect holiness during his lifetime; the solemn approbation of religious orders, which is the law by which the Church prescribes respect and esteem for a rule of life that is a sure means of sanctification. The infallibility of these laws is understandable because by them the Church manifests to all the faithful the means required for conserving the deposit of faith. These laws, therefore, are not the expression of a purely legislative power. They correspond formally to the exercise of the Church's teaching power because they are intrinsically linked with revealed truth. By establishing infallibly certain facts which are outside the domain of revealed truths, the Church presupposes the profession of a formally revealed principle which is to be defended through its concrete applications. So to summarize here just real quickly, the discussion around the infallibility of canonizations hinges on the fact that, as St. Thomas said, the veneration of saints is, in a sense, a part of the deposit of faith. It's about what we believe as Catholics and that we're professing it. Therefore, it's very serious business, which is why there are very strong arguments as to why the Church ought to have the assistance necessary to canonize infallibly, and that is a good point. He continues, infallibility is a property, and listen carefully to this, which supposes the essential definition of the act to which it corresponds. If the definition is changed, by the very fact the property attached to it changes. If the act becomes doubtful, its infallibility becomes doubtful also. Now, we're going to get into the weeds on this a little bit as we go, but this is an important point, and I'm going to repeat myself the odd time throughout this, but it's really important. Infallibility, the Pope having the infallible power, or the power to do things and to define things infallibly, it's not a magical power. He's not a wizard. He's not a demigod. He can't say, I declare as a sovereign pontiff that the best color of squirrel is gray. You can tell I'm looking into my backyard. I can see some squirrels. That's a silly example, but the point is that In order for something to be infallible and be known as such, it has to be very precise at what they're getting at. When we talk about things being made infallible, we need more precision, not less. It's not the case that the Pope has this like ethereal assistance from the Holy Ghost and he just can't do anything wrong or can't, produce bad doctrines or whatever. It is the case that when infallibility is going to be invoked, in order to be certain of the assistance of the Holy Ghost, the precision needs to be certain beyond any reasonable doubt. That's how we must understand infallibility. So as Father Glaze says, if the definition is changed, meaning what they're talking about, by the very fact the property attached to it changes. So if we have a different conception of what saints are at this period in time, which we'll see that the popes after the council have, and we change how we go about doing it and with the seeming intention therein, then we have reasons to go, they don't seem to be doing what was supposed to be infallible. They seem to be doing something else, and we have a different conversation to have. So keep that in mind. Okay. So we're going to get to the next piece. So here is where the meat of it begins. That was just the introduction. So we're going to define some principles, and a lot of this I think will be illuminating for many. So he says, we're going to define some things, etc. Okay, so some definitions. Beatification. Beatification is an act by which the sovereign pontiff grants permission to render public honor to the beatified in certain parts of the church until canonization. This act is therefore not a precept. It is a temporary, not definitive act. It is reformable. So someone who is a blessed could be removed from being a blessed. Beatification amounts to authorization of public veneration. The act of beatification does not directly assert either the glorification of the heroic virtues of the servant of God. Canonization. Canonization is the act by which the vicar of Christ is in an irreformable judgment inscribes a previously beatified servant of God in the catalogue of saints. The object of canonization is threefold, for this act does not involve the cultus only. Firstly, the Pope declares that the faithful departed is in the glory of heaven. Secondly, he declares that the faithful departed merited to reach this glory by the exercise of heroic virtues, which serve as an example for the whole church. Thirdly, in order to better set these virtues as an example and to thank God for having made them possible, he prescribes that public veneration be rendered to the faithful departed. So, canonization, historically understood, has three parts. It's not just about one being in heaven. Everyone who goes to heaven is of the communion of saints. We're not talking about the communion of saints. We're talking about particular individuals who are extraordinary, who we call canonized saints. Not the same thing. Your grandmother, rosary praying, wonderful old lady that she was, never missed a mass until she couldn't drive anymore and you had to drive her to church. No doubt that woman has made it to the pearly gates. Ask for your grandmother's intercession. And maybe she will be canonized. I don't know, maybe she was a saint. But that's not what a canonized saint is. Okay. Regarding these 3 points, canonization is a precept. It obliges the whole church. It constitutes a definitive and reformable act. The catalogue of saints is not the martyrology, and moreover, the expression inscribe in the catalogue of saints does not refer to a physical document, but merely invokes the intention of the church by which the act of canonization henceforth counts among the number of saints the newly canonized person and commands all the faithful to venerate him as such. And obviously this is a veneration in principle. You don't actually venerate every single saint, but meaning that it's for the universal church. The act of canonization declares definitively the sanctity of the canonized person as well as his glorification. Remember that. Definitively the sanctity. And we're going to talk about what that sanctity is and its heroic virtue, not just he was a nice guy. And consequently, it prescribes the cultus for the whole church. It is another thing to prescribe the celebration of a mass and recitation of an office in honor of the saint. This is a determination that requires a supplementary act, specific and distinct from canonization. The enrollment of a person in the martyrology does not signify the infallible canonization of the individual. The martyrology is a list that includes not only all the canonized saints, but also the servants of God that could have been beatified either by the sovereign pontiff or by the bishops before the 12th century, the date at which the Pope reserved to himself the privilege of conducting beatifications and canonizations. The titles of Sanctus and Beatus do not have in the martyrology a precise meaning which would enable us to distinguish between canonized saints and blessed saints and blesseds. And I want to jump over to some other research here to give a little background about this first 1200 years. Okay, so here is, as I said, the other work from Mr. Lamont, and he has a good background on how canonizations changed. So, and this is a different part, but it does play into what we're saying here, and I think he explains it really well. So before considering the arguments for infallibility of canonization, we should keep in mind the context in which these arguments were advanced. Canonization, as they addressed it, took two forms. There was what's called, and listen carefully here, and this helps also those of you who are doing conversations with Eastern Orthodox and talking about saints, this will give you some insight. Talking about equivalent canonization and formal canonization. Equivalent canonization happens when a pope decrees the universal veneration of a person to whom devotion has existed since time immemorial, and whose holiness and miracles are recorded by historians who are worthy of belief. Formal canonization happens when a pope decrees the universal veneration of a person whose heroic virtue and miracles have been established by a juridical process undertaken by the Holy See. There are still forms of canonization that exist today in this sense. Pope Francis canonized the Canadian Saint Marie de l'Incarnation in 2014 through the process of equivalent canonization. The canonizations whose infallibility is now in question are formal rather than equivalent. So before there was this process of canonizing saints in the way that we understand it, it was a local thing and something that spread just naturally. So St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. Athanasius, St. Vincent of Lérins, and so forth, these men were regarded as saints. And over time, we would say that they were officially canonized, sometimes by decree, like we recognize the worship of so-and-so since time immemorial, that sort of thing. But also, we use that term kind of equivocally. So, you know, if so-and-so has been venerated for 1,000 years, and his writings are included in infallible definitions of councils and so forth, and he's called a doctor of the church, and it's miracle upon miracle upon miracle, it's kind of just a given. And the argument is basically that, well, God would not allow such an error in his church to last for so long, and in so many places, and in so many documents, and in so many testimonies, and in so many lives, and so many miracles, and so forth, if this man was not actually worthy of veneration. So many of the saints that we talk about from the first 1,000 years of the church or so, they were never formally canonized. None of this means that they aren't infallibly saints. What it means is, or that they are not infallibly worthy of canonization. What it means is that it just wasn't the case that in all cases that was the case. Therefore, at a certain point, the Pope at the time basically decided, we're going to clean up a process and do this in a particular way to have more of, let's say, a centralization in the good sense. Okay, let's continue. All right, let's continue here. Similarities and differences. Beatification and canonization both have as object to make possible the cultus of the faithful departed, which supposes that during his lifetime, this person exercised exemplary virtues. The difference is that beatification only makes the cultus possible. It's a permission, while canonization renders the cultus obligatory. It's a precept and imposes this on the faithful. And we have the duty to explicitly believe in their heroic sanctity. In all of that, the essential is the exemplary or heroic virtue of the faithful departed. And this is what one seeks to verify in the two inquiries, that of the beatification and that of the canonization. So keep this in mind. Number one, most important, is proving the heroic virtue of the saint. Why? Again, the process of canonization is not about proving to everyone that the person is in heaven. Your great uncle may have been a scoundrel, a gambler, an alcoholic who beat his wife, and a non-Catholic. and then on his deathbed, by God's mercy, has a conversion, and he's baptized moments before he dies. That man pulled a Constantine, and he's a straight shot to heaven. He goes, it's go to heaven, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Like he's there. Although I guess that's jail in Monopoly. It's a get out of jail free card is probably the right analogy. And he's right there. And if you were there at the bedside and you saw the priest come into the hospital as he was dying from the cirrhosis of the liver from all his years of drinking, and you saw him be baptized, and then he gave up the ghost, you can go ask for his intercession. You know, great uncle so-and-so, the scoundrel who you prayed for 50 years or 40 years or whatever, he's in heaven. And, but we would never, ever, we would tell that story because isn't that an amazing story about God's grace? Obviously, it's a great testimony. It would do well at a Steubenville conference, get the kids excited. But we don't say, we now need a cause for so-and-so's canonization. Because the primary thing is this man worthy to follow as an example for the faithful? The answer is no. No one should ever presume that they could be a scoundrel and a drunk for their whole life and then get out of jail free with the last minute baptism. All right, so there's the issue. So the heroic virtue is primary. It's not secondary. The primary thing is not that they're in heaven. That's a necessary thing, but the primary reason for a cultus, a devotion, is because they're heroically holy, heroically saintly. And it says the miracles themselves are only taken into account as signs that attest to the heroic virtue. So many Catholics today think, well, there were miracles. That's what means you're a saint. Anyone in heaven can be interceded to or can intercede for us. That's not the purpose. The purpose is we establish the heroic virtue by an investigation, and which takes a long time historically, and then we test it, basically. The consequences of this. There's a difference between a saint and a canonized saint, and I've talked about this. I will not go into it too much, but he explains this is why historically there were so few saints. He says, even if saints were, meaning canonized, even if saints were numerous, only a small number of them, and not the majority, were elevated to the honor of the altars. Then again, the church has always given the examples of which the faithful are in need in their particular era. In this sense, canonization is a political act in the best sense of the term, not a partisan act of demagoguery, but an act that procures the common good of the whole church. He says, St. Joan of Arc was canonized in 1920, more than 500 years after her death. St. Therese of the Child Jesus was canonized in 1925, less than 30 years after her death. These two examples were beneficial to the church, but the first would have been too hard to comprehend had it occurred earlier or too soon, before the passage of time had blurred the context in the aftermath of a century-long conflict. There's another difference to be noted, the one between salvation and sanctity. As I said, a person who dies in the order of sanctity is saved, but one can be saved without having lived like a saint. And there we go. All right, now we're going to get to the definition of what infallibility is, because so often people just throw this word around and we don't even know what it means. What does infallibility mean? The question of infallibility is twofold. First, is the sovereign pontiff's judgment infallible when he canonizes a saint? Then, is it of faith that this judgment is infallible, such that denying it would be heretical? So two things. Can we establish that the sovereign pontiff's judgment is infallible when canonizing? And if that's the case, are we heretics if we say we don't recognize all canonizations? Good question. Each of these questions could be answered preliminarily following the indications given by Pope Sixtus V during the final consistory that preceded the canonization of St. Didacus. This is from a pope, and this is in 1588. And this is the Holy Father here. Basing his arguments upon Holy Scripture, theological reasoning, and all manner of proofs, the Pope demonstrated that the Roman Pontiff, the true successor of St. Peter and Prince of the Apostles, for whom Christ prayed, asking that his faith would not fail, who is the veritable head of the Church, foundation and column of truth directed and led by the Holy Ghost, cannot be mistaken nor induce into error when he canonizes saints. And he affirmed that this truth must be believed not only as a pious belief, but as the object of a very certain and necessary act of faith, and to establish this point, he adduced all the weighty arguments of reason and divine authority, to which he added also something quite obvious, that the laws of the church and of the Pope are certain and guaranteed whenever they concern the discipline of faith and morals and rest upon sure principles and solid foundations. Pretty strong. I've had some of my sedevacantist critics out there post stuff like this on Twitter and go, gotcha, you're a heretic, you're in communion with the anti-church, blah, 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 blah. Well, hold on. These words of the Pope proceed from him in his capacity as a private doctor. That is why the twofold question must be examined in greater detail and take into consideration the hypothesis of different theologians. Now, even if we were to agree that what this Pope said here, stamped it, locked it, can't erase it, it would still matter what is actually happening today. Because again, if you change the object, the result will be different. Or if you change the act, the object is different. And so there are multiple ways to go about this, but nonetheless, this was something, and if we go to the footnote, maybe I can do that just by doing a quick Control F search here. We can see if you want to find this. It's not going to do it, whatever. Anyway, I'll link it underneath and you can find it. Okay. Here we go. Canonization is infallible. So this is Father Glaze. As I said, he's a great theologian, and he's putting forth the strongest arguments possible. The infallibility of canonizations is today held to be a common and certain doctrine by the majority of theologians. All the manuals after Vatican I and before Vatican II, from below to Salveri, teach it as a common thesis in theology. The chief representative of the adversaries of the infallibility of canonizations is Cajetan, and he was a huge theologian, in the 8th chapter of his treatise on indulgences. According to him, the infallibility of a canonization is neither necessary nor possible. And the reason why he believed it wasn't possible was because there is an element that is speculative, because it's impossible for us in the metaphysically certain sense to know the state of a man's soul when he died, because that judgment is given to God alone. It's not a bad argument. There's something to it. Continuing. This opinion had already been defended more before Cajetan by Agostino Triunfo, or Augustine of Ancona, and he lived in the 13th and 14th century, in his Summa on the Power of the Church. His fundamental reasoning is identical to that of Cajetan, which is what I just said. We don't know exactly the internal form. And I want to say something here to some of my critics and some of those influencers and apologists who will do things like say, oh, the traditionalists aren't even Catholic, or the SSPX isn't Catholic, or whatever. You can't say things like that, because if someone's baptized and professes the Catholic faith openly, you can't say anything about what they believe inside. Someone who's baptized and professes the faith and attends Catholic sacraments is by definition a Catholic, even if they don't attend the sacraments and they're bad. You know, you could be a mass murderer who hasn't gone to mass in 20 years and you're baptized and confirmed, and you've never denied the faith. You don't belong to another church or something like that. You're just a terrible human being. You're still Catholic, and you are part of the Catholic Church, even if a dead member because of the mortal sin. You can't say other people aren't Catholic. No one has the right to do that in the declarative sense, unless there's something that's obvious that proves that they're not. Even if we take into account, let's just say we agree with some of the sedevacantists who say they can prove the manifest heresy of a pope or something, fine. But you can't just say this about regular people. You can't do it, especially if you've never talked to them. It's very sinful what a lot of these men are doing online, and it's very dangerous for their souls, but whatever. Since Vatican II, some conciliar theologians have adopted this anti-infallibist position. So that's really important here. Some conciliar theologians. So what's been interesting is I have been, accused of all these things of rad, trad, whatever. The funny thing is that by a lot of people who defend the church and against traditionalists, so to speak, the funny thing is that there's a lot of post-conciliar theologians who are in high-ranking positions right now in theological departments, etc., who argue that canonizations are not infallible. Some have alleged difficulties of an historical nature to call in question the infallibility of canonizations. The opinion defended by Augustine of Ancona and Cajetan was recently reprised by Father Daniel Oles. Now, this is about 20 years ago because this article is already 10 years old. From the Order of Preachers, a professor at the Pontifical University of the Angelicum and a relator for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in a study on the theological basis for the cultus of saints. Let's look at his footnote here because there's information. And this man is a high-ranking theologian who his job is to talk about canonizations officially from the church, and he's a conciliar theologian, meaning he's not part of some traditionalist order. Here it is, number 11. And this is from his paper, and it's called Fondamenti Theologici dei Culti dei Santi, del Studium Congregationis de Causi Sanctorum Pars Theologica, and from Rome, 2002. And this is pages 1 to 54. So if you can read Italian, go get that work. This is a summary of his statement there. Hypothesizing an error on the part of the church in the canonization of a non-existent or even a damned person, Father Oles affirms that this would not present any drawbacks for the faith. Since infallibility is necessary only if the error would be harmful to faith. Canonizations do not require it. In effect, there is a disadvantage for the faith if the church's error in a canonization were to induce the faithful to a practical profession of either heresy or immorality. But this condition does not occur since the practice of the faithful influenced by a canonization prescinds from the existence and the glorification of the canonized saint. In case of error, the personal conviction of the faithful would be a sufficient basis for their devotion. So basically, what does this mean? This means that this man is arguing a priori, as a fact, that canonizations are not infallible, and that it's a good thing that they're not infallible, because there could be a mistake made, and we wouldn't say the church has infallibly led the church. We wouldn't say the church has infallibly led people into error, because that would be against infallibility. Lastly, Monsignor Brunero Gherardini, in an article published in Divinitas, drew up an assessment of the controversy over this subject. This study revived the issue insofar as it takes into account the various reactions prompted by the recent canonizations of John Paul II. And Gherardini is a big deal theologian in the official sense in Rome historically in the last 20, 30 years, by the way. And the end of that article by him presents a series of objections contrary to infallibility. So let's just summarize here. It hasn't been officially defined. There is dispute about whether it's even possible by big-name theologians. Even Thomas Aquinas, who firmly believed canonizations were infallible, said it's of pious belief. You can discuss it, and you can even be employed in Rome in today's church, not just as a rad trad from the SSPX or whatever, some idiot like me on the internet, and you have not sinned in doing so. And no one has the right to tell anybody that they have. He continues, following St. Thomas, the great majority of canonists and theologians defend the thesis of the infallibility of canonizations. Let us remark that the proposed question is very precise. This is important too. St. Thomas does not ask if the Pope is infallible when he canonizes a saint. The focus of his questioning is to know whether all the saints who have been canonized by the Church are in glory or if some of them may be in hell. This way of asking the question already affects the answer. So for St. Thomas, canonization calls for infallibility not in the first place as a disciplinary law, but as the profession of a truth that is virtually revealed. This does not exclude the other two aspects, the example of the saint's life and the prescribed cultus. So this is the genius of St. Thomas. Because Thomas would have known that it wasn't defined. And he is concerned with infallibility in the sense of only whether or not the person who is called a saint is in heaven or not. That's as far as he seems to go with it. And that doesn't actually affect those who disagree. And disagree with him isn't the right word, because almost nobody disagreed with him, and almost no traditionalists would disagree with Thomas in this if we are talking about the context wherein he was discussing it, which we'll get into. But his focus of infallibility is not about whether or not the person is demonstrative of heroic virtue, so for the canonization process as such. He's basically saying the infallibility is kind of a low bar or a baseline that the church is not going to say so-and-so is a saint when he's actually in hell. That actually doesn't affect traditionalists because, for example, pick someone who's a saint from after Vatican II who has a dubious, holiness. I have no problem believing. Let's take a pope like Paul VI. I don't think Paul VI was a very good pope. I think he was a really, 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 really bad pope. And I wrote about that a lot in my book, What Happened to Catholicism. A lot of his stuff people don't know about. That being said, he was the pope and he died with his sacraments and he has a bazillion people praying for him. And I don't think he didn't have the faith. I have no problem believing that he is in heaven. I mean, was he devoted to the scapular? Did he pray the rosary every day? What are the promises attached to that? Released from purgatory by Saturday or whatever. I mean, so even at Thomas, when assessing infallibility, it's about whether or not we would be led to believe someone in hell is in heaven. And that's kind of as far as the certainty goes. So very interesting. Father Glaze continues, but there is an order among the three judgments the Pope makes when he canonizes a saint. The first judgment bears upon a theoretical fact and states that a deceased person preserved to the end in the heroic exercise of supernatural virtue and is at present glorified in eternal beatitude. Theoretical is important. This goes back to Cajetan. We actually can't know with infallible certainty in a human sense how someone was on the inside when they died. So all we can do is look at all possible evidence and come to a conclusion. The second judgment gives the heroic virtues practiced during the canonized person's lifetime to the whole church as a model to imitate. So not only are we sure that they preserve to the end, which again, your grandmother could have done, and hopefully she did, or will do, or maybe you're a grandmother and you'll do it yourself. That's one part. But then as far as, hey, are we going to put this up as a model to the church? That's a different story. And the third judgment is a precept that imposes public veneration of the saint on the church. Canonization gives the heroic virtues of the saint as a model and makes his cultus obligatory, but it assumes the fact of the saint's glorification. Benedict XIV, and he was the most influential pope and pushing forth this notion of infallibility and canonizations. I believe he's the one who centralized the process. Who quotes and adopts these reflections of St. Thomas, considers that, in the last analysis, the judgment of canonization rests upon a statement of a speculative truth deduced from revelation. It remains to prove that this threefold judgment is infallible. To do so, we do not have at our disposition any argument of the supreme teaching authority for the infallibility of canonizations as being defined for it has not been defined as a dogma. Again, it hasn't been defined, so we don't have anything to go off of there. St. Thomas limits himself to giving what would be the equivalent of an argument from authority, a reductio ad absurdum. That doesn't mean that it's absurd, it's a philosophical way of arguing, which is, if you will, the authority of the first principles of reason and of logic. There are two reductions. Denial of the infallibility of canonization would incur an unlikely twofold detriment, one in the practical order and the other in the speculative order. The first, reductio ad absurdum, on the practical level. If canonization were not infallible, it might happen that the faithful would venerate a sinner as a saint. Those who had known him in his lifetime would be led to believe, on the church's authority, that his sinful state was not in reality what it was. But that would result in confounding virtue and vice in the minds of the faithful, and this would be an error deleterious to the church. The second reductio ad absurdum is on the theoretical level. St. Augustine says that if there were an error in the teaching of divine revelation consigned to the scriptures, faith would be deprived of its foundation. But just as our faith is based on the teachings of sacred scripture, it is also based on the teachings of the universal church. Hence, if an error were found in the teachings of the universal church, our faith would likewise be deprived of its foundation. Now, God cannot deprive the faith of its foundation. Hence, like the teaching of sacred scripture, the teachings of the universal church, including canonization, must be infallible. Dominic Banez completes this argument by specifying that if one affirms the possibility of error in the canonization of saints, the church militant would be scandalized in its morals. Its profession of faith would be made suspect, and the church militant in heaven would be insulted. That's interesting. So again, these are the strongest arguments possible in favor of the canonization of saints being infallible. To corroborate these defensive arguments, St. Thomas then uses an argument of theological reason. The judgment of canonization is a judgment of the Pope in a matter that implies a certain profession of faith, since to venerate a saint and imitate his virtues is to say implicitly that one believes he has attained the glory of heaven. Now, in these matters that touch upon the profession of faith, the Pope's judgment is infallible because of God's promise. The judgment of canonization is hence infallible. That's the argument. It is at this point useful to turn to clarifications given by John of St. Thomas in order to understand why the divine assistance is here required in particular. The judgment of canonization can be understood as a conclusion resulting from two premises. The first is a formally revealed conditional. Whoever preserves to the end in the heroic exercise of supernatural virtues obtains an eternal recompense in glory. The second is a probable fact attested by human testimony, such one of the faithful did persevere to the end in the heroic exercise of the supernatural virtues. So it follows that we know that it's formally revealed, meaning we know for certain that if you preserve to the end, you go to heaven. And therefore, it's based on probability, after this, based on the testimony. This is how this process works. The conclusion that flows from these two premises is thus obtained by means of testimony, and that is why it does not flow from a real, absolute, compelling, scientific demonstration. There always is a level of speculation. This is why the process has to be beyond doubt. The judgment of canonization involves a line of argumentation which the classical logicians would have considered as probable. We find there what must normally be proved in every theological reasoning, since the proposition stated in the conclusion in this case is linked, albeit indirectly, to a truth of faith. This link is only indirect, for between the truth formally revealed and the conclusion intervenes the mediation of a truth that the certitude of which is not that of faith. Here's the important, and again, remember this. In general, since we are dealing with speculation about the state of a man's soul when he dies, there is always going to be an indirect, not direct relationship between what we believe as a matter of faith and what we profess about a Catholic as a matter of, about a saint as a matter of faith. And this is why the process needs to remove all possible doubt from this in order for us to say we can be certain of the divine assistance here in the sense of infallibility. Continuing. Though only indirect, the link exists and the conclusion is rooted despite everything in a formal and explicit profession of faith. The difference that leads one to say that this argument is only probable is that to establish a theological conclusion, one reasons from an evident and certain proposition of reason, whereas to establish the judgment of a canonization, one reasons from testimonies. This is why divine assistance is necessary, precisely at the level of the discernment of the testimonies. Infallibility cannot accompany an act in which one appeals to contingency and of which the certitude remains only probable. One could object that if canonization is considered as infallible, it is placed on the same level as solemn ex cathedra definitions, which seems inconceivable. Benedict XIV answers, with all of the most assured theological tradition, that such assimilation is on the contrary in the order of things. So basically the argument here is that because we're not dealing with revelation, we're dealing with someone who is a human being who we have relative certainty about. To say that it's like defining something as if we're defining a dogma, or the Pope is defining a dogma, that's not really possible. And this is where the infallibility of it tends to get disputed. Certainly, one cannot univocally reduce canonization to an infallible dogmatic definition. So it can't be infallible in the same way. Even if it were to be, it would not be in the same way that sort of the definition of the Immaculate Conception would be, for example. But one may nonetheless consider that the act of the infallible solemn magisterium happens in analogically various ways. So an act of the Pope having as its end the conservation of the common good of the entire church is an act of infallible definition. That would be the argument there. Now, the Pope conserves the common good of the whole church, not only when he acts strictly as supreme doctor in teaching, but also when he acts more broadly as supreme pastor in governing. The teaching of the doctor does not exhaust all the activity of the pastor, and it is incumbent on the pastor to make the laws that provide for the common good of the whole church. As such, these laws do not express formally revealed truth, but insofar as they are given for the good of the unity of faith, these are analogues of an infallible definition. So it's the idea is that it's basically infallible by way of analogy. And Father Glaze says, let us add one additional reason to justify this analogy. Again, he's trying to prove from the strongest arguments possible the thesis that canonizations are infallible. As he says, we have shown above, based on St. Thomas and his commentators, that if canonization is in consequence a model and a law, it is formally and foremost immediate profession of faith. One could already rightly assimilate it to a definition. Canonization could be reduced to the exercise of the infallible and personal solemn magisterium of the Sovereign Pontiff as its secondary object. Among other authors, Father Salveri cites several examples in which one sees that the terms employed by Pope Pius XI and XII express without the least doubt their explicit intention to exercise a solemn infallible act. Archbishop Lefebvre would often say that Pope St. Pius V had canonized the rite of Mass. He meant thereby to signify the infallibility of liturgical laws by analogy with that of canonizations, and he thus supposed the latter as very probably equivalent to a personal act of the Pope's solemn magisterium. Now I'm going to jump over back to this work of John Lamont for a little bit of context here about this act by the Pope of canonizing. And this is where the free preview is going to end. Now, we're going to do that on the other side of the paywall, so you can watch it now by signing up underneath, or you can wait a week, 10 days, whatever, and see the rest of it. I'll see you on the other side.